Test 1, 1, 2, test. Howdy, and welcome to Season 5 of Film And. It is a beautiful sunny day here in Burlington, Vermont. I am in the Champlain Wave offices recording the Season 5 opener. And it's crazy to think that it's only been a short 4 months since Season 4 ended up finishing. Of course, you might notice that I am not currently joined by the old host Connor Randolph. He has since moved on to actually a new show, To Watch to Read, which he co-hosts with his girlfriend. It's been really cool listening to all the things they cover, mainly films that have been adapted into novelizations or adapted from books, things to watch and to read. So I cannot recommend that enough. But we are here at the original radio show that started it all. And no, it's not Radio Rialto, who you might know from Steve's radio show, who we've had on a bit. No, we're talking about Film And I'm so happy to be back for a 5th season. We have some really fun stuff planned this semester, and I can't wait to get into it. So we are starting off this 5th season of Film And with a new kind of a format. Maybe one I'll come back to if I can think of another good one, but I wanted to do something of a starter pack. And if you're not familiar with the format of a starter pack, it's kind of this idea of if you want to get into a genre, if you want to get into some kind of sort of movement of alt or culture or some kind of group of things, starter packs are there to kind of give you an idea of some surface level stuff to kind of get you interested in something. And ever the film nerd, I decided to do a starter pack on obscure film genres in general, just obscure film genres. I could have picked one, but I wanted to talk about a bunch of them. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 obscure film genres that I have scoured the internet and the very limited selection of reading at the Champlain Library on Film to find these genres that have felt almost lost to time. I do not know where these come from, but man, oh man, they are very interesting touchstones in the history of film, and I can't wait to talk about them today. So I guess let's get on into it. The first one we are starting out with, number 1, we have Austern film. Now, if you don't know Austern, I imagine you don't. I didn't until maybe a month ago when I started researching this episode. It is also known as Red Westerns, and Red Westerns were a genre of film that were actually created in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc as a version of American Western films and spaghetti Western films of the mid to late 60s and early 70s. Some great examples of that: The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Fistful of Dollars, etc., etc. But what was pretty cool is that this specific genre was split into 2 types of subgenres of this already obscure genre of the overall Red Western look. You had the proper Red Westerns, which were more films that were set in America's Wild West, but involved very different themes than the U.S. Westerns, the actual American-produced and directed Westerns employed. And then there were these things called Easterns, which were opposite from Westerns. And the translation of Eastern is Austern, which is the more traditional term for this entire film genre. So essentially, a lot of these films in the Austern genre were set on the steppes or the Asian parts of the Soviet Union, the plateaus of Mongolia and Siberia, and presented a style inspired by American Western films, which were very somewhat closer to the original movement of Westerns and spaghetti Westerns. And you even have some of the Eastern German films in the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet bloc at that time, that were called sauerkraut Westerns. But all of this kind of fits under the umbrella of Ostern. And the film that I decided to highlight is called White Son of the Desert. It's a 1970 film. And I have to say it's arguably one of the most popular Ostern films, not only when it came out, but just to stand the test of time. And I think this is a perfect way to kind of get into this genre. It ended up winning the state prize of the Russian Federation and the Lenin Komsomol Award for screenplay. And I have to say it's a pretty visually spectacular film for its time, just considering what it is. And overall, I think it really does capture this really cool mise-en-scène of just this wide, expansive desert epic. Despite being in the 4:3 aspect ratio, it still feels like a very wide film. It's not exactly a wide image, but you do get a lot when you're watching it. And it's what I like is it's such a departure from what we've seen in traditional Westerns and spaghetti Westerns, because it's just literally shot in different locations along the world. I think it has more Middle Eastern influences with the structures that they were using, and also just the context of being a Soviet film and having access to the expansive landscapes of the Soviet Union at the time was pretty amazing, and allowed this film to really shine in its visual language. So I would recommend it. 1970, White Son of the Desert. It is free on YouTube. And that's something that is truly amazing, because it's not only just free on YouTube, it's pretty good quality free on YouTube. It's a part of the Most Film YouTube channel, which I find myself watching quite a bit. But yeah, moving on, we have our second genre of the day, and that is going to be Bollywood horror. Now, at least for me, a Westerner, I don't usually think of Bollywood as a very horrific genre. I usually think of it in the most popular films that it's kind of sent across to America. The musicals, the bright colors, the dancing, the epic films. I mean, if you haven't seen Sholay, folks, do yourself a favor. Watch Sholay. That's a classic. And essentially, Bollywood horror is this very interesting subgenre of the Bollywood industry in general, because it kind of started out very much in these more independent, low-budget roots, and it's still to this day, I think, like a lot of modern horror movies in America, in Europe, in really around the world, is some of them end up being kind of hits, and others are kind of obscure duds or just kind of cult classics. And you have this wide spectrum of popularity when it comes to the horror genre. So it's pretty cool to find films within the Bollywood context of this, because I think one of the films, the one that I picked, that really started off the suspense, thriller, horror movement of Bollywood is 1992's Raat. That is spelled R-A-A-T, if you're interested. It is an Indian, Hindi, Telugu bilingual supernatural horror film written and directed by Ram Gopal Varma. If I said any of that wrong, apologies. Boy, what a movie, you know? This thing is... Whoo! So essentially, the plot of this movie is that a family moves into a haunted house, and eventually their daughter Minnie becomes possessed. And I really don't want to say anything more than that, because I really don't want to spoil this. I think this does some really just interesting things with the horror genre that it's working inside of. I think it's really cool to see such a different perspective and just a different culture, and seeing those influences used in a point of suspense and thrill to scare the audience is really fascinating. So if you can find this film, this is one I had quite a bit of difficulty finding a good version of, but if you can find this, it's not only that, it's a pretty nice visual as well, because it was shot on 70 millimeter. It's critically acclaimed in India. And I can't recommend this enough if you're looking to get into, I think, some more interesting examples of the Bollywood film industry, which is, I think, just as thriving in its diversity as I think some expect it to be. Because I feel like over here, we don't usually get to hear enough about these lower budget Bollywood films, these more interesting or even just more classic examples, like Raat 1992. That's not a modern film, essentially. It's from almost 30 years ago now. But we don't end up hearing much about it except for, the hits. Or like Slumdog Millionaire, which just really employs sort of a dual production of, using American and Bollywood cinematic themes and production styles. But yeah, moving on to our third one. Oh man, this one. This might be the weirdest one I found, but easily the most lighthearted. We're talking about the third obscure movie genre in this starter pack, sea life sports films. Yes, I'm as confused as you all, or at least I was until I started researching this. When it comes to unusual films, this is something that I found very often is that a lot of Japanese films ended up being on the forefront of a lot of interesting, obscure genres, for better and worse, and this is easily one of the most interesting versions of that, one of the most interesting experiments, and it comes from this idea of, very similar almost to the idea of your monster films of the original Godzilla era, your Honda era Godzilla films. The original kind of movement of sea life sports films was in fact begun in the 1950s, early 60s, and it just kind of faded off into obscurity. But there was a film that came out in 2003 that's called Crust, directed by Mark Locke. It's a film from the United Kingdom that kind of revitalized the genre, not in a sense of like making it a movement and a whole bunch of films inspired by Crust came out after it. No, it was more almost like an homage to this really dead subgenre of bizarre films that came out in Japan in the 50s and kind of employing the themes that those films originally stood on. And essentially, sea life sports films were based around this kind of sports film aesthetic of, sparring or fighting or having some kind of competitive sports element, but with sea life. So, in the example of 2003's Crust, it tells the tale of a giant shrimp purchased by a pub owner who teaches it to box. And it does not exactly sound like the plot that would attract crowds of British people, and indeed, the film was a flop at the cinemas. That was a direct quote. And what was insane is it ended up actually getting 2 more sequels, Calamari Wrestler, Crab Goalkeeper, and it just kind of became this really bizarre, kitschy sort of trend. Not even a trend, but really just sort of like a joke series of films. But, when I look at this in retrospect, I think it's just such a fascinating touch point on a filmmaker kind of looking back into the annals of film history and trying to find these really just interesting, unique film experiences and kind of updating it for a modern day, which I can really respect, This was the film I truly could find almost nothing on. I found the description, I found some IMDb stuff. There's really not much on it. It was a pretty obscure, low budget, and, forgotten film, and I'd love to find more on it if I can. But I can't help but think that this is just a really cool example of obscure films kind of reaching out into the world and just trying to find an audience where it can, because these kind of weird concepts are the joy of cinema, being able to find such crazy, diverse ideas like a British pub owner buying a giant shrimp and teaching it to box, because why not? All right, we're going to take a quick break, a quick PSA break. You'll be hearing from probably all dining services here on campus, good old Sodexo. And you'll hear back from me in 15 to 30 seconds, and we will go into the next 3 genres of this obscure genre starter pack. See you in a second.
Running late to class but still need that morning caffeine or hot breakfast to start your day out right? Download the Bite app by Sodexo and place your custom order for fast, easy pickup at Zyme. Open 8:30 a.m. to 3 o'clock p.m. Mondays through Fridays.
All right, welcome back to Film and. Glad to have you listening. We are, of course, in our Season 5 premiere episode, and we are doing a starter pack of obscure film genres. And moving right into the next one. This is probably the least obscure genre I dug up, but I think it was pretty interesting to look at the history of noir films. Now, obviously, classic Hollywood noir, I think, reached its peak in the 1940s, obviously found its roots in the 30s going up, cultivating this aesthetic of dark, brooding, crime, thriller genres that were really some of the biggest films coming out at the time. Your Double Indemnities, and really even Casablanca to a good extent, is very much a classic Hollywood noir film with, I think, a lot of other elements going into it. But what I wanted to talk about today is not just noir. I think that's a pretty fairly well-known genre for people, I think. I want to talk about neo-noir, which is obviously, I think from you can tell, new noir films that are kind of inspired by this original movement of dark, brooding, psychological crime thrillers from the 1940s in America, and having really a resurgence in other cultures and other just contexts of life. And the one I decided to pick is in fact 1960s film Afraid to Die. So basically, when you look at the history of neo-noir, I think this genre of film reached its lowest point of complete irrelevance of filmmaking in the 1950s. But it was in fact in the 1960s with director Yasuzo Masumura making a 1960 Japanese Yakuza film called Afraid to Die, which was one of the very first examples of a neo-noir film, which easily employed some of the most direct references and aesthetics to the American noir genre. And I think this is such an interesting example. And I feel like this is such a good inclusion in the starter pack, because I wouldn't really want to not talk about a film like this that, granted, very obscure, maybe not a surface level, entry level film to go into neo-noir. I mean, for that, I could do a quick recommendation: Bad Times at the El Royale. There you go. That's your entry level neo-noir film. But I really did want to talk about the roots of neo-noir, where it was these films that were getting made when this genre was kind of long gone, and kind of recontextualizing that into the Japanese crime syndicate Yakuza in this film Afraid to Die. So essentially, quick plot. Takeo is a young Yakuza who renounces his former criminal activities after being released from prison, but sometimes escaping the past is not so easy. That's such a good tagline. That's such a classic tagline for a film. But that's essentially all it is. It is free to watch on Tubi, which is this amazing streaming service. It's free. It's got so many obscure old films that no one wanted to buy, so you can just see them. I think it's really cool. Please watch it if you can, if you're interested, if you want to. But yeah, with everything I previously mentioned, I think this is a great way. If you want to talk about the history of noir cinema, this is a great place to start after you're finished with Hollywood era. Talking about the roots of neo-noir and just how genres can be revitalized in these really cool new cultural contexts. So, moving on. Number 5. This is arguably, I think, for any film boy, for any true film bro who is listening, this is definitely a genre you've probably heard of. We're talking, of course, about Dogma 95. And how can I not? I mean, this is such a perfect encapsulation of the independent and low-budget cinema that was coming to the forefront during the 1990s. You have so many people with access to filmmaking like never before, making these low budget, crazy films. And I think seeing that really caused a global shift in independent film and just new voices kind of in the camp. So this is coming from obviously a filmmaking movement in Europe, started in 1995 by Danish directors Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg, two powerhouses of European cinema. They created the Dogma 95 Manifesto and Vows of Chastity, which essentially lays out this whole list of rules of making films that can only be made in very specific traditional ways. So, the 10 rules, if you are interested, I will list them out now. Shooting must be done on location. The sound must never be produced apart from the images or vice versa. The camera must be handheld. The film must be in color. Optical work and filters are forbidden. The film must not contain superficial action like murders or weapons. Temporal and geographical alienation are forbidden. That is to say, the film takes place here and now. Genre movies are not acceptable. The film format must be Academy 35mm, and the director must not be credited. And beyond that, they add this vow of chastity saying that the director is not an artist, but merely a piece to create this more like separate addition to the Dogma catalog. It's a very interesting movement. But the one I want to talk about, obviously, is the one that started it all, the 1998 film Celebration. It's hard not to talk about Dogma and not mention Celebration, also known as Festen in its original language, which I believe is Danish. I think it's Danish, but it might be German. I'm not sure. A very interesting film. And it was actually, it's Danish. I was correct. Selected as the Danish entry for the Best Foreign Language Film at the 71st Academy Awards. But it was not accepted as a nominee. I think it was really cool because the Danish national film scene was actually validating Dogma 95 as much to take its very first Dogma film and have it be the official selection for the Academy Awards as Best Foreign Language Film. And it also won a jury prize at the Cannes Film Festival in 1998. So this is one that definitely reached, I think, the height, granted at the start of the movement, but it was one of these peaks of critical acclaim and success for the Dogma movement. And I think it really started to fade right beyond this first year. But it's a pretty fascinating story. It tells the story of a family gathering that they come together and celebrate their father's, the patriarch's, 60th birthday. And it's a adult comedy that juggles subjects of death, trauma, and family. I actually saw this. It was one of the first films I ever saw in film school. I'll take you back to fall of 2017, and I'm sitting in my film screenings class with Mira and Dean Paula at the time, showing us this crazy Danish film, The Celebration, after, I believe, just watching Memento and Pan's Labyrinth. And then this is the third movie they show us. And man, I was amazed at what I was seeing. I had never really seen a movie like this, and it's a very raw, granted comedic, but raw, dark film about, I think, a lot of the impacts that patriarchs can have on their family and kind of the damaging effects that last even 20, 30 years later of mismanaging a child's youth in just the most horrific way possible, but also, again, done as a bit of a comedy. It has comedic elements. I mean, I remember sitting there in screenings, there were some giggles. We were laughing, So it's a really fascinating film, and I can't recommend it enough, but it's definitely, I think, a heavier watch. But I will say this, it is not as heavy as the next subgenre we are talking about, and this is number 6, the final obscure genre of this starter pack. We're already here. And of course, we are talking about, no, not of course. We are talking about the Russian alt movement, primarily known as necro-realism, which is a genre of film focusing on black humor and the absurd, and at many times exploring themes of death, decay, and the transformation of the body. This is a movement that kind of started in the mid 80s, went on into the early 90s, and became this really bizarre take on Soviet cinema and kind of these specific films and their obsession with death and dying, necrorealism, and kind of the idea of the physical form that death takes in situations of all sorts of situations. I think just contextualizing that in many different social situations. And there's a couple films I really could highlight here. You have The Wooden Room, Silverheads, Bipedalism, Killed by Lightning, Werewolf Orderlies. But the one I want to talk about is Vladimir Maslov's and Yevgeny Yufit's 1991 film Daddy, Father Frost is Dead, which I don't know where that title came from, but it's a hell of a title. Yeah, essentially the plot of this film is a biologist obsessed with the idea of writing a treatise on a new kind of mouse becomes witness to a number of bizarre and horrific events, from his son's suicide to the S&M engaged in by respectable middle-aged men to his own family's psychic morbidity, which is basically to say that this is a film that indeed deals with these more pastoral looks at this character's life and observations kind of weaved into this very bizarre story, and always circling around these themes of decay and death. And what's so fascinating is that this movement, I think, reached its height during the destruction of the Soviet Union, during the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union being broken up, the Eastern Bloc returning to Europe, and the beginning of the formations of the European Union, Afghanistan, and a lot of the stands in the northern Middle East, and having these points of revolution and independence, and the Soviet Union just dissipating, ceasing to exist. This social and cultural structure that has existed for almost 2 generations now of this country's existence, coming to a head and just decaying, much like the themes of these films. And I wonder, at least if you delve deeper into these, if anyone would start to see kind of connections between that. I think this is one of those genres that interested me for that reason, is the historical context of when these films were coming out, I think might lend some light a bit on what these films meant to people and why they were being created the way they were being created. But I wanted to talk about Daddy, Father Frost is Dead specifically because it has some very iconic imagery that I think gets forgotten in Soviet cinema. But obviously, it has these very long and intense shots, but it's a very dramatic and atmospheric film in the way that the best Soviet films, I think, are. And I always just find it so interesting watching these, because it is very much these characters almost wandering in this bizarre natural environment with these very sharp with these very sharp angles and lighting choices. Very similar to, I guess, your German impressionism of the 1920s. Very similar to that, but obviously almost in a more Soviet context with just their surroundings and the environment they were shooting in. But this is a black and white film and also free on YouTube. Not the most amazing version, but not bad. Still has a very the visual style still comes through, but it is somewhat disturbing at moments. More cerebrally than physically, but I can't recommend it enough if you're into some necrorealism. Don't worry, there aren't too many dead bodies. It's not just corpses for 90 minutes. It's more. From what I saw, there's very little in the way of actual dead bodies. It's a bit more artistic, I think. It takes some old license with the themes of death and decay and transformation. But yeah, that was it. We are here at the end. That is my obscure genre starter pack. 6 obscure genres that you might be interested in, and 1 film that I think can work as a very interesting entry-level point. So, if you've seen any of these films, if you want to see any of these films, obviously I'll have the links below if you're listening to the YouTube version. If you're listening live, I will be starting, of course, my Film and Letterboxd list, which you don't need a Letterboxd to find, but hey, get Letterboxd. It's an amazing app for rating and logging movies that you've seen. Of course, I will always plug Connor Randolph's Letterboxd. That is CRAND Berry 18. That is Cranberry 18 on Letterboxd, and my own as well, DA_N, which is where you'll be able to find the new Film and list, just movies we talk about on this radio show, starting with this episode. This will be the first couple of movies. So yeah, as always, thank you so much for listening. Have a great rest of your year, and I will see y'all next week. Goodbye.